Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole. This is another one of our weekly congressional chats. Frankly, we were unable to record this last week because we were still voting on the House floor on the so-called infrastructure bill at midnight on Friday. So we had to wait until this week to actually talk about what happened last week. Congress actually began November with four major tasks in front of it. The first one was to pass the infrastructure bill. That was actually done on very late Friday night, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The second, which remains to be done, is to deal with the so-called reconciliation bill, or what Democrats like to call the human infrastructure bill. Much larger spending package with a lot of moving parts and a strictly partisan measure being advanced under the arcane budgetary process called reconciliation, which means it can avoid a Senate filibuster, therefore doesn't have to be bipartisan, and frankly is not bipartisan. Third, we'll have to deal with the debt ceiling by December 3rd. And fourth, you would hope to deal with the appropriations process, that is the normal running of government that is funded in 12 different bills, by sometime before the end of the year. Certainly government funding runs out again on December 3rd, so the matter is going to have to be addressed one way or the other. Let's go back now to the infrastructure bill. Infrastructure bill, frankly, was a deeply flawed product for a number of reasons. When it was originally passed by the Senate in August, we were told that it was fully paid for. But when the Congressional Budget Office actually put out a score, we found out that it was actually short somewhere between $256 billion and $398 billion, depending on which set of economic assumptions one wanted to use. But by any measure, it was going to add considerably to the deficit. That made it very unpopular, certainly on the Republican side of the aisle. Second, of course, normally when we pass a transportation or an infrastructure bill, it's simply done, the Senate does its own bill, the House does its own bill, we go to conference. That didn't happen this time. The Senate bill was negotiated not in the main committee, where Oklahoma, frankly, is very well represented by Senator Jim Inhofe, but by a group of senators ad hoc. And they fashioned a bill that, guess what, took care of their states, but not particularly others. I'll give you a pretty good example in that. Oklahoma gets about $5 billion worth of projects under the infrastructure bill. That's certainly something that we would be happy to have. However, West Virginia, represented by Joe Manchin, which is less than half the size of Oklahoma, actually gets more money, $6 billion. And you can go through the bill, and there's case after case like that where, frankly, more conservative parts of the country or Republican parts of the country were punished to one degree or another. Certainly, in the case of Oklahoma, neither of our senators voted for the infrastructure bill. I think that was a pretty good sign to all of our House members to not do so either. And in the end, none of the Oklahoma representatives did do so. Of course, another problem was, from a House standpoint, we were cut out entirely. The entire bill was written in the Senate, so no member of the House of Representatives, regardless of party, actually had any input. I've been in the House and voted for previous infrastructure packages in 2005, 2011, 2016, one under a Republican president, two under Democratic presidents. Each time I voted in favor of the legislation. I did so because I was able to impact that legislation in terms of programs that were important to my district, projects that were specific to my district as well. I never had the chance to do that this year, neither did anybody else, and of course that costed a good deal of support. Finally, and maybe in some ways most importantly, after the infrastructure bill passed the Senate, the president and the speaker announced that, before that was passed, we would have to agree or have the votes to pass the much larger reconciliation bill. That's a much larger spending bill. At the time they made that announcement, $3.5 trillion. It's been whittled down now to some degree. But that pretty much killed the prospects for there ever being much Republican support for it. No Republican will support the reconciliation bill. It has considerably higher taxes. It keeps a moving target. It has things that punish the energy industry. It's simply not a very popular bill in a place like Oklahoma. And if you're told that voting for the infrastructure bill will help you pass the reconciliation bill, not many Republicans, certainly no Oklahoma Republicans, are going to go along with that. So at the end of the day, the president and the speaker managed to make what's normally a very bipartisan and non-controversial bill that serves the needs of all Americans into a very partisan bill where House Republicans in particular and Oklahomans felt shut out of the process. And consequently, you saw very few Republican votes and no Oklahoma votes for the bill. Looking ahead, when we get back, it'll be a busy week. While the infrastructure bill was passed and will be signed by the president, the reconciliation bill is still up in the air. A group of moderate Democrats said that they weren't going to vote for it until they had a better idea of what it cost. Frankly, they signed an agreement with their progressive counterparts and delayed the vote while we wait to try and get additional information. I can tell you the real cost of this bill is going to be considerably higher than is advertised. What the Democrats are doing now is simply paring back parts of the bill that would normally fund programs for a decade to fund the same programs for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. But the idea in the end is to make them all permanent. And so while the bill, at least what we've been told, because we haven't seen final text, has about $1.5 trillion in revenue, supposedly. Some people have questions about that. The spending, if all of it were actually made permanent, which is the design of its authors and certainly the president, would total someplace between $4 and $4.6 trillion. Again, that's not likely to get much support. Looking at the other two projects I mentioned further down the road, Congress does have to deal with the debt ceiling. We can't allow the United States to default on its debts. But since Democrats have decided they're going to do all the spending, and they have all year long, then they're going to have to produce the votes for the debt ceiling. And the good news is they have those votes. They have the majority in the House. They've passed the debt ceiling increase through there on a couple of occasions already. They're going to have to work hard procedurally in the Senate, but again, they have the votes, they can do it, and probably will do it. As for funding the rest of the government, something that's enormously important to Oklahoma, to places like Tinker Air Force Base and Fort Sill or the National Weather Center, variety of different interests and concerns here in Oklahoma, I think that's unlikely to get done by December 3rd. And so we're going to be confronted with the decision, do we vote for another continuing resolution? That is something that simply keeps spending at its current levels and try and settle the appropriations process early next year, or not. My hope is, again, we could get it done, but I think it's very unlikely. So I think it's much more likely there'll be an extension of government funding into early next year. I do not believe the government will, nor should it, be allowed to shut down. That's not in anybody's interest. So again, things last week were hot and heavy. Things in the week ahead will also be extremely difficult. Once we get back into Congress, we're actually on a break this week while they try to work out some of these numbers and resolve some of these issues on the Democratic side. But I expect things to be hot and heavy in Congress from now, frankly, to the end of the year. And we'll keep you informed on what's happening, try to do our best to represent the interests and the values of Oklahoma. Thanks for listening. Look forward to chatting with you next week.